The announcement that Carrefour will shut down stores in Bahrain and Kuwait has sparked headlines across the region. But behind the immediate news lies a bigger story, that international retail giants are struggling to keep up the interest of Middle East consumers. Consumers are increasingly turning their backs on big-name internationals and favoring local brands, homegrown experiences, and also practices that resonate with their regional identity. This is not necessarily out of rejection for global brands, but rather to meet their needs and values. So today, we're digging into this shift that's quietly seeing global names start to fade from store shelves and ask, how far does it go? And is it for all retail or just produce in certain items? Whether it's grocery chains rebranding or shoppers demanding moral business practices, the region is seeing a tilt, and it's reshaping everything from supply chains to branding strategies. By the end of this episode, we hope to answer, is this just a trend or is it a new defining feature of the Middle East and North Africa's retail landscape? We'll hear from experts about what makes a local brand resonate and dive into examples of companies adapting or failing to the new demand. All this and more on Business Extra. I'm your host, Salim Essaid. Joining me is Aarti Nagraj, the Deputy Business Editor at The National, who has been closely following the story. Aarti, thanks a lot for speaking to us today.
Thanks, Salim. It's great to be on. And yes, it's a topic that we've been following pretty incessantly this last week. But yeah, it's sparked a lot of interest, and understandably so as well.
Yeah, exactly. And you wrote a great report, which was doing very well online in terms of reader interest. So can you walk us through the timeline of Carrefour's exits in Bahrain, Oman, Jordan, and finally Kuwait?
Yeah, it's been these sudden announcements that have been dropped. This has started late last year. So the French retailer first said it's exiting the Jordan market in November last year, followed it up with exiting Oman's market, that was in January, and then silence. And then all of a sudden, September 14th, it said it's exiting Bahrain and then ceasing operations in Kuwait on September 16th. So it's been a slew of announcements that have been dropping all from Carrefour's side, not directly from their regional operator, Majid Al Futtaim.
And what's the reason for all this? Like, what official reasons has Majid Al Futtaim given for these closures?
So what Majid Al Futtaim has a long-standing relationship with Carrefour. They've been operating Carrefour stores here since 1995. So that is the context to it. They did not give us a specific reason for it. But what they did say is that they have taken the decision to exit Carrefour from these markets. And they say it's driven by customer requirements and what customers need. And also, very importantly, they say they're trying to localize their approach. So localize the supply chain and, in their words, provide a fresh and affordable locally sourced alternative. So this is what has said is the reason for this move.
And Hypermax is the name of the new local brand that Majid Al Futtaim will be positioning in its place. Can you describe how is Majid Al Futtaim positioning it in comparison to Carrefour?
So Hypermax, which again, it's interesting because the way they positioned it is to say, oh, it's not replacing Carrefour, but it is replacing Carrefour. And on Reddit threads as well, what we've been reading up is a lot of the people who are shopping in those markets say that Carrefour brands, shelving brands, were just basically rebranded into Hypermax. But from Majid Al Futtaim's perspective, what they say is that, again, going back, they say this is their idea of something that's completely owned by them. So it's their decision in terms of what goes on shelves. It's to provide something that's local. It's to reach out to customers better. Now, analysts who we spoke to say that this whole exercise could be due to a variety of different reasons. One, it could be due to financial profitability and the contribution of all of these particular markets to their sales. So it's interesting because Majid Al Futtaim operates Carrefour across a number of markets within the region. But for now, and they confirmed to the National that Hypermax is only opening in these 4 locations as of now. They told us they have no further plans for that brand right now in the region. So according to analysts, it depends on these specific markets not performing great. Another thing is that this is again another point that's come up from other analysts, that it could be because of Palestine, the BDS movement that we've seen. A lot of consumers have boycotted several brands. It could be another driving factor. It could also be because they are looking at boosting their own operational entity. So this gives them the flexibility and freedom to decide on what products they want to display, what pricing points they want to offer. They have huge experience now operating by themselves in the region. So looks like it could be a variety of all of these factors that's played into this decision.
Definitely. And that's what I wanted to ask you about next. Because Aarti, you did a lot of research and speaking to a lot of experts to understand why this is happening. And a lot of it seems to be the customer response. So can you describe what that looks like across markets where Carrefour has already shut down and Hypermax has opened?
So the Majid Al Futtaim retail CEO is Gunther Helm. He recently gave an interview on Dubai Eye, and he said so far the response has been overwhelming, in his words, in the markets that Hypermax has opened in. In terms of what we've been reading up and seeing online, there seems to be, again, I think a lot of it is driven by the boycott movement. A lot of people are happy to go shopping in brands which they feel are locally sourced, are not international ones. So there is that element. But there is also bickering about, oh, Hypermax, the bill is not right. This is not okay. Are they giving us these bags? The typical, very consumer level complaints that you face, you would see with any supermarket anywhere in the world. So I think it's interesting. As customers ourselves, many times I had somebody tell me that Carrefour shutting down would also affect tourism. And I was very surprised, like, why would it affect tourism? Just thinking. And his perspective was that it's because a lot of people who come to city center, again, he was talking about the UAE, but was saying that if people who come to city center, see the brand, know the brand, come there because they identify. But then it depends on who you are catering to. And especially in the markets where they've opened Hypermax, you see it's very highly domestic market, people who prefer their local grocer. And so I think they're trying to tap into those trends. And the bigger picture is that they're facing, all retailers, brick and mortar retailers are facing tremendous competition now from e-retailers. So I think there are a number of dynamics that go into all of these elements.
You and I are both here in the UAE, Aarti. So can you answer the big question of whether there are plans for Majid Al Futtaim to replace Carrefour here with Hypermax or to rebrand?
So yeah, this is the big question, isn't it? Everybody wants to know. And the response, the CEO was very clear that they have no plans to change Carrefour stores in the UAE. That stays. They told the National very clearly that they have no plans to open Hypermax stores in any other locations as of now. So the CEO didn't rule out that it wouldn't happen in the future. He did say it's always on the table and that they always take a look at all of these decisions. But for now, we have the Carrefour stores in Mall of the Emirates, in all of the big malls, still operational and running.
Exactly. So enjoy it while it lasts. Aarti, thank you so much for your great research and for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Salim.
And now, what does this pivot away from an international brand tell us about the future of retail in the region? To understand this, I'm joined by Dr. John Katsos, Professor of Management, Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the American University of Sharjah. John, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Salim.
Can you start us off by telling us, from a retail perspective, what does it mean when a major international franchise brand retreats in favor of local brands?
It could mean a couple of things. So it could mean that there's just a tactical repositioning based on market size and strategic importance. So it could mean that there's a pivot based on social and political pressures. It could mean that regulations and licensing costs have shifted. It could mean a lot of different things, in other words. So it's hard to draw hard and fast rules about why there might be a pivot in general. And when we look at specific instances, that's where we can start to dig in and think through why the changes might have taken place.
Did the Carrefour incident of switching to a local brand stand out to you in any way?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about it are the markets that they decided to make the changes in. So far the announcement's been for Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and Jordan. And yet Majid Al Futtaim has brands that are not just in the GCC, but are throughout the region. So it has the Carrefour brand in Egypt. It has it in Saudi Arabia. It has it in the UAE. But its regional coverage extends as far north as Armenia and Georgia and as far south as Kenya and Uganda. So what we're not seeing is a full shift away from Carrefour. Instead, it's a shift in particular markets. So seeing that, we have to then take a look at why that would be the case. And what seems to be similar across those markets is not necessarily population amount, is not necessarily demographics, but is likely having to do with what margins they were pulling in those markets. Once you have something like a boycott impacting a brand, it's not going to be the higher margin brands that get affected. It's going to be the ones that were already running fairly thin margins for whom the boycott tipped them over. So data on boycotts is that in general, they don't have large impact, even when they take up large portions of the consumer base. And yet a small impact on a very thin margin would likely tip a company over the edge to make it no longer profitable to stay in with that brand name.
So would you say in Majid Al-Futtaim's case with Carrefour that it was a combination of mainly, I guess, ethics when it comes to retail, and then also with the lower margins when it came to sales from Carrefour as a brand to make that switch?
I think what we can say is that the boycott was certainly a part of it and a contributing factor, but was unlikely to have been the only factor, right? Those markets are not similar enough that in terms of both population and in terms of other sorts of demographics that are there, age, spending power, and the like, to all be for the same reason, or for all to be because of boycott. If you tack on boycott plus smaller margin, suddenly you have a combination of factors that means the brand was not going to succeed there in its current format. And we're seeing already that they're not opening smaller stores. The Hypermax stores that are opening up in Oman, for instance, are the same stores. Right, they're in the same physical location. They have the same square meter footprint, and they're in the same locations in the Majid Al Futtaim Mall. What that means is there was something going on with the brand, right, and the social political pressure as a result of the boycott. It has to be a part of that, presumably. But it's unlikely that 2023 was the start of those problems. It's much more likely that those problems started much earlier and related to smaller margins.
And on that point, first of all, as you mentioned, the retail market is vast, but I wanted to understand from you that are you seeing this trend of consumers in the region shifting to more local brands when it comes to how they want to consume? Are you seeing this widespread across the retail market?
Yes, I think it's happening widespread, but it's just not happening with all the consumers. So I think there's been an increasing trend globally anyway for people to be shifting, usually for sustainability reasons or for ethical reasons, to more locally produced products. And there's been a slower uptake of that mindset among consumers in the region, but it's still there, and it's still significant enough that shifting to a more locally sourced model, which is what Hypermax is claiming to do, it makes business sense. It's only going to get bigger. It's not going to get smaller. So consumers generally prefer those local products, but the local products have to be at equivalent value. So not necessarily equivalent price, not even necessarily equivalent quality, but that price to quality difference has to be the same or better for the locally sourced products for people to be willing to change. There's some customers that, for sustainability or ethical reasons, will pay extra, right? They'll pay more for the locally sourced products. But again, they have to see that value. We're seeing this in the UAE landscape with not just food, right, but across a number of products. But we're especially seeing it in other regional economies that are able to produce a lot more locally. Jordan would certainly fit into that category, even though Kuwait, Bahrain wouldn't necessarily fit there.
And if I heard you correctly, you had said that it's not the consumer that's driving this. So if that's the case, where are you seeing most of the push from in terms of this pressure?
So I think a number of factors are coming together. So on the consumer side, what's happening is there's an awareness of the sustainability impact of bringing in products from the outside. So that is a component of it. But some of it is just market fundamentals. Transportation costs are higher across the board, right? Some of that has to do with fuel, but some of that has to do with things like political risk. Some of it just has to do with the raw materials underlying some of those products being more expensive. That means that having locally sourced products is going to be cheaper generally. Another factor that's happening is we're seeing much more widespread, much more democratized ability for companies at a local level, at a smaller level, to learn from the efficiencies of bigger corporations. So basically, they can produce their products at a much higher quality than they might have been able to 10 or 15 years ago, largely because of things like the internet. So a local farmer has better access to not just suppliers, but to know-how to do things better at the local level. Again, that might be in the farm scale, right? Very small, but it also fits for industrial production as well. All these factors together has meant that the local options are becoming more palatable to the retailers. And that's where some of the trouble is, that retailers and suppliers will often have decade-long contracts. So you might sign up for a supplier for 10 years, 20 years to supply all of your French fries if you're a fast food chain, or all of your water bottles if you're in like Carrefour or Hypermax. In that kind of environment, it's very tough to switch locally, even if you wanted to. And those contracts only come up for renewal every so often. So the dynamics at play are things that are more long-term and are affecting everyone globally. And now we're seeing them play out in the region, all in kind of the same time frame, in part because those contracts are going to come due.
Definitely. And it seems like from what you're saying that it's not caused by one particular thing, whether consumer demand, but definitely driven by at least a good portion in terms of localizing better prices, quality, that type of thing. So do you see from that more, I would say, distributors from the region going that direction, as in shifting from using the international brand name and localizing, using more local brands? And if so, in which areas of retail do you see that happening?
So I think retailers would love to have local suppliers for goods. The issue has always been two factors, price and quality. So if you can manufacture something domestically and you can do it cheaper and at the same quality as Chinese or European manufacturers, great. I think retailers would be on board. Realistically, that's extremely difficult because there's economies of scale that exist in those places that simply don't exist locally in our region. Where we're seeing the biggest shift is food. So the shift in food makes, and this is why the Hypermax shift also makes sense. Food has spoilage problems, right? And because you have spoilage problems, the cost of transport and the quality as a result of that transportation is going to affect the product, right? So it's going to affect that value that consumers see, which means your local products will already have a quality advantage. So there's certain types of the fruits and vegetables, for instance, that need to be flash frozen before they're ripe in order to be transported. That's not the case if you have a locally produced item, right? You can have something that's closer to ripe, be transported to the supermarket in a relatively short amount of time, and then be good to go on the shelves. And other markets have dealt with this, right? So the United States is probably the prime example of this. The whole reason the railroad system in the United States exists is largely because the areas that produce food and the areas that have population centers are disparate. Because they're very far apart, you have to have these rail networks and the layer road networks. In places like our region, where we're water scarce, and we're arable land scarce in many places, there were challenges that existed for a very long time in terms of producing enough food for our population. That shifted because of technology. So because of things like aquaponics and hydroponics, because of greenhouses that are air conditioned, because of cattle store areas where we can air condition the spaces for the cattle, those dynamics have shifted so that we can put things into place locally that allow us to produce much more local food. Milk being sort of the obvious example, right? So the UAE and Saudi produce much more cow's milk than they probably should based on the amount of arable land and water that they have. But local companies were able to create a set of dynamics that made it cheaper to do that than to import milk from the outside.
And looking at other factors as well, I mean, one thing after COVID that we all saw is that people want to order things online, especially when it comes to food shopping, myself included. I want everything yesterday and I get frustrated if I don't get it the same day. So do you see things like this affecting the future of retail models in the region? For example, like part of it being wanting instant service, instant quality, and ethical backgrounds. How do you advise companies and how do you see the future of retail looking forward?
Yeah, so instant service is a huge issue. I think a lot of that, funny enough, has to do with things that are extremely local. So things like how our city is designed. So if you look at a city like, if you compare, for instance, Doha with Amman, these cities are structured completely differently. And when you're looking at kind of these instant gratification, I want my delivery within 24 hours sort of services, there are going to be places for which the city is designed in such a way that people don't need that. So in a particularly older cities, if you can walk down to the corner and get what you need for the day, and then you only have to go out and get sort of the big purchases. So think of your laundry detergent, cleaning supplies, bigger bulk things. But on a daily basis, your eggs, your milk, your bread, you can go locally to very small shops nearby. It's very hard to break those habits, and people seem to prefer that. And so we've seen this play out, particularly in Europe, that has this dynamic similar to our region, where you have some older cities that are structured on walkability, and you have some newer cities that are structured around the car. If you have a city that's structured around the car, you need those conveniences. It's not possible to go out and spend 45 minutes going and 45 minutes coming back for a dozen eggs. It's just not a possibility. So I think as retail chains are looking at those expansion models, they're looking at those sort of very micro levels. How is this particular city designed? How are its regions designed? So not even at just the city level, but at the sort of a neighborhood level. Are there certain neighborhoods that are not being served that there's a market for? And are there other neighborhoods where, well, we could provide the service, but it really doesn't make a difference because it's not worth the expansion of drivers and resources.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So that it's going to be different for each country in the Middle East. It's not going to operate the same way. And you have to look at the ecosystem, the infrastructure and mobility to determine how retail brands are going to structure themselves, integrate with consumers. So yeah, it seems like there isn't one map for all. But when looking at international retailers now facing this shift in the region, how do you see them adapting? And also distributors here, do you see them going more local, not working with international partners as much or in a different way? How do you see that moving forward?
I think, funny enough, I would have answered this question differently before the US tariffs. So before the US tariffs, I would have said to you, there's a shift to local and a shift to closer markets. I think post tariffs, what's happening is everyone is trying to make sure that their distribution channels are as diversified as possible. So a lot of my work is about crisis response. And what's becoming clear is that many international brands, I'd say most international brands, but many local brands are starting to internalize a lot of the conflict risk information that we know. And one of those is diversification of supply, right? Don't depend on single source suppliers for more or less anything, because you don't know what's going to happen in the US or China or France or Germany, right? You don't know what's going to happen in any of these places. And so to avoid catastrophic supply chain failures for yourself, you're going to diversify, even if that means a little extra cost for some of those suppliers. So there's some suppliers that, even local suppliers, where the cost may actually be more, right? They may not be producing something that's cost competitive compared to their international competitors. And yet suppliers and retailers are going to start saying, you know what, no, we want to stock those, because if something happens where suddenly there's tariffs on US goods, or suddenly we're no longer having import potential from China or something, those political dynamics play such a role that you want to be diversified enough to be able to continue to supply the basic goods.
It seems like it's going to be an exciting time to see how things develop moving forward and how much is locally sourced, how much is a different type of international. But yeah, I guess we'll have to wait in the years to come to take a look at that. But Dr. John, thank you so much for speaking to us. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Salim. Happy to be here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Business Extra from The National. Make sure to check out The National's podcast wherever you stream. This episode was produced by our podcast editor, Duat Farid. Arthur Edison is our audio engineer, and I've been your host, Salim Essaid.